They tell us that Rome was a city of white marble and golden law. They point to the statues of stoic men and draped matrons, frozen in silent dignity. But look closer at those statues. Look at the necks. Behind the grandeur of the Caesars lies a gutter, slick with the blood of the women they couldn't break until they did. History is written by the victors, but the truth is screamed by the vanquished. When Rome conquered a kingdom, they didn't just take the land, they took the soul of its royalty. This isn't a story of crowns and palaces. This is a journey into the shadows of the Tullianum prison, into the suffocating weight of the triumphal chains and the ritualistic erasure of the world's most powerful women. Tonight we exhume the stories the Senate tried to bury. Welcome to the dark fate of the fallen queens. The Roman triumph was never merely a victory parade. It was a carefully choreographed descent into psychological hell designed to shatter the soul of a monarch. For a queen who had spent her life atop a throne of ivory and gold, the first contact with the Roman street was a sensory assault of dust, spit, and mockery. The air, once perfumed with frankincense in her palace, was now thick with the stench of the unwashed masses who crowded the curbs to jeer at her fall. She was forced to walk the Via Sacra not as a human being, but as a living prop in a play written by her executioners. Every step on the jagged cobblestones was a calculated reminder that her divinity had been stripped away, replaced by the crushing weight of iron. The Senate understood that to truly kill a queen, you must first kill the idea of her majesty before the eyes of the world. To maximize the humiliation, the Romans utilized a cruel irony by draping the fallen queen in her own stolen royal regalia, turning her symbols of power into a costume of shame. She might wear the very crown that once commanded armies, yet it sat heavy on a head bowed by the exhaustion of the Tullianum's dungeons. Her wrists were not adorned with the bracelets of a ruler, but bound by manacles specifically designed to clink rhythmically with every desperate stride she took. These chains were often plated in gold, a sadistic Roman flourish intended to show that even her previous wealth now belonged to the state. Behind her, the treasures of her ancestors were hauled on wagons, stripped from her temples and bedrooms to be displayed as common loot. This visual contrast served to emphasize that she was now nothing more than an ornament to a Roman general's burgeoning career. The physical toll of the march was secondary to the ritualistic dehumanization performed by the crowds and the soldiers who marched alongside the captives. Legionaries would sing ribald, filthy songs at the queen's expense, mocking her lineage and her womanhood to the delight of the laughing Roman citizenry. Children were encouraged to throw rotten fruit or stones, teaching the next generation of Romans that foreign royalty was a beast to be tamed and taunted. There was no sanctuary in silence. If she kept her dignity, she was called arrogant, and if she wept, she was mocked as a weak and broken creature. The parade lasted for hours under the blistering sun, ensuring that by the time she reached the Capitoline Hill, her spirit was as frayed as her hem. This was the mercy of Rome, allowing a queen to live just long enough to see her entire legacy turned into a crude joke. Furthermore, the triumph served as a terrifying domestic message to any Roman woman who might harbor ambitions of political influence or independent power. By parading a foreign queen in chains, the patriarchy of the Senate reinforced the boundary between the virtuous Roman matron and the monstrous female ruler. They wanted the public to see that a woman who dared to lead an empire ended her journey in the dirt, her hair matted with the grime of the city. It was a spectacle of gendered violence disguised as national pride, proving that no amount of royal blood could protect a woman from Roman justice. The queen was used as a mirror, reflecting the absolute dominance of the Roman male over the exotic and the feminine. In this theatre of cruelty, her very body became a map of Roman conquest, marked by the bruises of her captors. As the procession neared its climax at the Temple of Jupiter, the atmosphere shifted from carnivalesque mockery to a cold, sacrificial dread. The queen would be led to the foot of the hill, where she was often separated from the main parade to be taken to the darkness of the prison. While the general ascended to offer thanks to the gods, the fallen queen was cast into a pit to await her final, silent erasure. The cheers of the crowd above would filter down through the stones, a muffled roar of a civilization celebrating the systematic destruction of her life's work. In those final moments, the realization would set in that the triumph was not the end of her journey, but the beginning of her oblivion. Rome did not just want her land or her gold, it wanted the memory of her defiance to be strangled in the dark. The legend of Cleopatra VII is often painted in the soft hues of a tragic romance, yet the reality was a brutal chess match played against a backdrop of impending slavery. Augustus Caesar, then known as Octavian, did not desire her death. He craved her presence as the crowning jewel of his inevitable triumph through the streets of Rome. He envisioned the Queen of Kings, the woman who had captivated both Caesar and Antony, walking behind his chariot in heavy, mocking chains. To Octavian, she was the ultimate prize of war, a living trophy whose public humiliation would solidify his transition from a mere general to the first emperor of Rome. He kept her under strict surveillance in her monument, desperate to preserve her life so he could parade her body like a captured animal. But Cleopatra was a ruler who understood that the ultimate power over one's life is the decision of when and how to end it. The psychological warfare within the palace walls was a silent storm of desperate negotiations and hidden daggers as the queen realized her time had finally run out. She saw the construction of the Roman victory floats and knew that her children were destined to be displayed as orphans of a fallen, decadent East. Octavian tried to seduce her with promises of safety and mercy, but his eyes betrayed the cold hunger of a man who only saw her as a political asset. Cleopatra knew that Roman mercy was a myth, a gilded cage designed to house the broken remnants of those who dared to defy the Senate's absolute will. She began to prepare her final act of rebellion, turning her private chambers into a sanctuary of ancient Egyptian rituals and lethal, whispered secrets. Her suicide was not a retreat into the shadows of history, but a calculated strike against the man who thought he had already conquered her soul. The arrival of the asp, hidden within a simple basket of figs, was the moment the queen reclaimed her sovereignty from the encroaching Roman iron. As the venom entered her veins, she was not a victim of despair, but a commander orchestrating her final and most significant military maneuver. She chose to die in her full royal regalia, adorned in the finest silks and the diadem of the Ptolemies, ensuring she would be found as a queen. This was a direct insult to Octavian's plans, as it denied him the satisfaction of seeing her disheveled, weeping, or dressed in the rags of a common prisoner. By the time the Roman guards burst through the doors, the Golden Queen had already crossed the threshold into the afterlife, leaving behind only a cold, beautiful corpse. She had successfully navigated the narrow path between total submission and eternal legend, leaving her captors to find only the empty shell of their prize. Octavian's fury upon finding her lifeless body was the scream of a man who had won the world but lost the war of the spirits. He was forced to parade a wax effigy of the queen in his triumph, a hollow and plastic substitute for the vibrant, dangerous woman he had failed to tame. The Roman crowds cheered for the image, but the intellectuals and the soldiers knew that the true Queen of the Nile had outplayed the master of Rome. Her death was a stinging rebuke to the Roman concept of total conquest, proving that a woman's will could be more resilient than the legions of the Republic. By choosing the serpent, she linked her fate to the ancient gods of Egypt, ensuring her story would be told with awe rather than the pity Rome intended. The dark fate Rome had planned for her was replaced by an immortal legacy of defiance that still echoes through the marble halls of history. Cleopatra's final act remains the most powerful example of a fallen queen turning the tools of her destruction into the foundation of her eternal myth. She knew that in the Roman narrative she was supposed to be the Eastern whore who brought ruin to great men, but in death she became the martyr of a lost world. Her blood did not stain the cobblestones of the Via Sacra. Instead, it sanctified the land she refused to abandon to the greed of the Caesars. Rome tried to rewrite her story as one of vanity and weakness, yet the sheer effort they spent trying to erase her suggests a deep-seated fear of her memory. She remains the ghost that haunts the Roman victory, a reminder that the most powerful empire in history could not break a single woman's resolve. In the silence of her tomb, the Queen of Egypt still holds the final word over the man who thought he was her master. Zenobia of Palmyra stood as a terrifying anomaly to the Roman establishment, a desert queen who had dared to sever the eastern limbs of their empire. When the Emperor Aurelian finally breached the walls of her oasis capital, he found a woman who refused to beg for the mercy typically reserved for the defeated. Her capture was treated as a monumental achievement, equivalent to the conquest of a great power, because she had unified the East under a banner of Syrian defiance. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Zenobia was not immediately executed. She was preserved as a high-value political asset, a living symbol of Rome's restored dominance over the rebellious Levant. She was transported across the Mediterranean not as a passenger, but as a prize of war, destined for the ultimate theatre of Roman cruelty. The journey to the capital was a slow, agonizing realization that her days of riding at the head of cavalry charges were forever replaced by the heavy silence of the captive. The spectacle of her entry into Rome was designed to be the most lavish display of imperial power the city had witnessed in generations. Aurelian spared no expense in her degradation, forcing the queen to walk the parade route draped in so much gold and jewelry that her physical strength failed her. The chains that bound her wrists and neck were forged from solid gold, a mocking tribute to the legendary wealth of her lost kingdom of Palmyra. While the Roman chroniclers wrote that she was so beautiful she looked like a goddess in chains, the reality was a brutal trial of endurance under the weight of her own treasures. Each step through the roaring crowds was a calculated attempt to break her spirit, turning her royal status into a heavy, glittering burden that dragged her toward the earth. This was not a celebration of her life, but a ritualistic burial of her political identity beneath the suffocating finery of her captors. Reports from the era suggest that Zenobia's composure during the triumph was so unnerving that it actually drew a strange, begrudging respect from the Roman populace. Rather than weeping or showing the expected signs of female frailty, she looked upon the screaming mobs with the same cold, calculating eyes that had once commanded the armies of the East. This defiance in the face of absolute ruin forced Aurelian to reconsider her execution, as killing such a legendary figure might have sparked further rebellion in her home provinces. Instead of the garrote in the darkness of the Tullianum, she was sentenced to a gilded fate that was arguably more soul-crushing for a woman of her ambition. She was granted a villa in Tibur, near the emperor's own estate, where she was kept as a high-profile political prisoner under the constant surveillance of Roman eyes. Her world, which once stretched from the banks of the Nile to the mountains of Anatolia, was now reduced to a few acres of manicured Italian gardens. The transition from a warrior queen to a Roman matron was the ultimate act of psychological erasure performed by the state to neutralize her legend. Some historical accounts claim she was married off to a Roman senator and lived out her days as a quiet socialite, but this version of history likely served as Roman propaganda. The Senate wanted the world to believe that the Eastern Tigress had been domesticated, her wild spirit broken by the civilizing influence of Roman culture and law. In truth, this was a living death, a state of perpetual house arrest where her every word was monitored and her children were raised as Romans, disconnected from their Syrian heritage. She was kept as a curiosity, a conversation piece for the Roman elite who would visit her just to see the woman who had once made the Caesars tremble. This mercy was a strategic weapon, ensuring that Zenobia would die not as a martyr, but as a faded memory of a forgotten war. Zenobia's dark fate lies in this forced assimilation, a colonialist strategy used to absorb and then delete the identities of those who dared to challenge the status quo. By allowing her to live, Rome robbed her of the dramatic, defiant end that Cleopatra had used to secure her place in the eternal halls of history. She became a ghost within the very system she had tried to dismantle, a tragic figure whose later years were spent in the suffocating comfort of her enemy's embrace. Her name was eventually scrubbed from the active political consciousness of the empire, replaced by the narrative of a woman who was fortunate enough to be spared by the generous emperor. Yet beneath the veneer of her quiet Italian life, the memory of Palmyra remained a jagged scar on the Roman psyche that no amount of marble could truly cover. Her story remains a haunting reminder that for a queen who once ruled the sun, a life in the shade is the cruelest form of slavery. Boudica's story begins not with a crown, but with the raw, jagged edge of Roman betrayal that ignited a fire across the mist-shrouded plains of Britannia. When her husband Prasutagus died, he left half his kingdom to Rome in a desperate bid for peace. Yet the empire responded with the cold brutality of a debt collector. The Romans did not merely seize the land. They publicly stripped the queen and flogged her like a common runaway slave, while her young daughters were subjected to unspeakable violations. This was a calculated act of terror, meant to demonstrate that under the Roman boot, royal blood held no more value than the mud of the marshes. They sought to break the Iceni spirit by desecrating the sanctity of their ruling family, believing a woman would simply wither under the weight of such profound shame. Little did they know that in their arrogance they had traded a peaceful neighbor for a vengeful goddess of war who would soon paint the province in Roman blood. Driven by a rage that transcended the physical world, Boudica raised an army from the blackened hearts of tribes who had similarly suffered under the eagle's shadow. She did not fight for territory or tribute, but for the fundamental right of a people to exist without the suffocating collar of Roman civilization. Her path through the Roman colonies of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium was marked by a scorched earth policy that left nothing but ash and the screams of the dying in its wake. She transformed the symbols of Roman luxury into funeral pyres, showing no mercy to the occupants of the villas who had grown fat on the labor of her people. To the Romans, she was a nightmare manifested, a tall, terrifying figure with a mane of tawny hair and a voice like a spear crack, leading a horde that seemed to rise from the very earth itself. Her vengeance was a primal scream against a system that viewed her daughters as property and her kingdom as a mere entry in a ledger. The climax of her rebellion at the Battle of Watling Street remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Roman military's encounter with the barbarian world. Despite outnumbering the legions, the Iceni were caught in a narrow defile where their numbers became a trap, turning the battlefield into a chaotic slaughterhouse of iron and bone. The Romans, disciplined and cold, pushed forward with their shields, trampling over the very families who had come to witness what they believed would be a final liberation. Boudica watched from her chariot as her dreams of a free Britain were systematically butchered by the professional efficiency of the Roman war machine. The air was thick with the scent of iron and the cries of the trapped, a grim symphony that signaled the end of the Celtic world as she knew it. In that moment of absolute ruin, the Queen realized that Rome's true power lay not in its law, but in its capacity for total, unblinking extermination. Rather than allow herself to be dragged back to Rome to face the same chains that had broken Zenobia or the mockery that Cleopatra had died to avoid, Boudica chose the poisoned cup. She knew that as a captive, she would be used as a prop in a triumph, a broken trophy to be displayed before the same Senate that had ordered her flogging. By taking her own life, she executed one final act of sovereignty, ensuring that the Romans could only ever possess her lifeless, unyielding corpse. Her death was the ultimate no to an empire that demanded total submission, a refusal to let the victors write the final chapter of her physical existence. Even as her life faded, she remained a symbol of the untamable spirit of the North, a queen who preferred the silence of the grave to the noise of a Roman cage. Her end was a dark, quiet victory, robbing the Emperor Nero of the one thing he needed to truly claim victory: her public humiliation. In the aftermath of her fall, Rome attempted to perform a damnatio memoriae, so thorough that for centuries, the very location of her final battle and her burial remained a mystery. They tried to scrub her name from the annals of history, portraying her only as a nameless, frenzied spectre of chaos rather than a legitimate sovereign defending her home. This systematic erasure was the second death of Boudica, a Roman attempt to bury her legacy beneath layers of propaganda and the literal ruins of her burned cities. They feared that if her story survived, it would serve as a blueprint for every other oppressed province to rise up and reclaim their stolen dignity. Yet, despite their best efforts to silence her, the memory of the Queen with the spear survived in the whispers of the soil and the oral traditions of the survivors. She remains the ghost in the Roman machine, a reminder that the price of their Pax Romana was paid in the blood of mothers who refused to be slaves. Beneath the bustling streets of the Roman Forum lay the Tullianum, a subterranean nightmare designed to strip the final remnants of dignity from the world's most powerful women. For a fallen queen, this was the ultimate descent from the sun-drenched balconies of her palace into a damp, lightless void that smelled of ancient rot and stagnant water. There were no stairs to this lower chamber. Prisoners were lowered through a narrow hole in the ceiling, a symbolic burial while the heart still beat. The stone walls were slick with the condensation of centuries, echoing with the muffled footsteps of the very citizens who had just cheered for the Queen's destruction. In this cold, cramped silence, the reality of her new status as Roman refuse became an inescapable, suffocating weight that pressed against her chest. This was the place where Rome stopped pretending to be a civilization of laws and revealed its true face as a machine of cold, calculated terror. The environment of the Mamertine prison was specifically engineered to induce a state of sensory deprivation and psychological collapse before the final execution occurred. A queen who had once been surrounded by the finest silks and the most loyal servants now found herself shivering in rags on a floor slick with filth. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional flickering torch of a guard whose task was to ensure she did not cheat the state of its kill. Time lost all meaning in the pit as the days bled into a singular, unending night of terror where every sound from above signaled a potential end. She was left to contemplate her failures while the distant roar of the Roman crowds celebrated the general who had dragged her here in golden chains. This was not a prison for rehabilitation or holding. It was a digestive tract where the empire slowly consumed the enemies it could no longer use for sport. When the moment of the ritual execution finally arrived, it was carried out with a clinical indifference that was perhaps the most horrifying aspect of the entire process. The executioner, often a low-ranking slave or a hardened soldier, would descend into the pit armed with a simple length of rough, hempen cord. There were no last words allowed, no royal proclamations, and no witnesses to record her bravery for the scrolls of history or the memory of her people. The queen would be forced into the dirt, her neck bared to the garrote as the Roman state prepared to snuff out the last spark of her sovereignty. As the cord tightened, the physical struggle was brief, but the symbolic violence of a monarch being strangled like a common thief was a message intended for the ages. In the eyes of the Senate, this was the necessary cleansing of the world, removing a feminine threat that had dared to challenge the masculine order of the eagle. Once the life had left her body, the cruelty of Rome did not cease, for the treatment of the corpse was the final act of the queen's public dehumanization. Her body was often dragged from the pit with hooks and cast out onto the Gemonian stairs, a place of public infamy where the corpses of criminals were left to putrefy. Here, the royal remains were exposed to the elements and the whims of the Roman mob, who were encouraged to defile the body as a final show of patriotic fervor. This was the second execution, a ritual intended to prove that even in death, the queen possessed no sanctity that Rome was bound to respect or protect. Eventually, the remains would be unceremoniously tossed into the Tiber River, ensuring that she would have no tomb, no monument, and no sacred ground to call her own. By denying her a proper burial, Rome sought to trap her soul in a state of perpetual wandering, forever severed from her ancestors and her gods. The horror of the Tullianum remains a testament to the lengths Rome would go to ensure that a fallen queen was not just defeated, but utterly erased from the physical world. It was a factory of oblivion, a dark mirror to the bright marble monuments that the emperors built to celebrate their own supposed virtues and divine right to rule. Every stone of the forum above was paid for by the silence enforced in the pit below, a structural necessity for an empire that thrived on the total subjugation of the other. We only know of these women because their stories were too powerful for even the darkness of the Mamertine to contain, leaking out through the cracks of history like blood from a wound. The Tullianum stands as a grim reminder that the glory of Rome was built upon a foundation of broken women whose final screams were swallowed by the earth. It is the silent, beating heart of a history that Rome tried to hide, but which the modern world is finally beginning to exhume. The final and most chilling weapon in the Roman arsenal was not the sword or the silk cord, but the damnatio memoriae, the total erasure of a queen from the fabric of time. When the Senate decreed this sentence, it was a command to the universe that a woman's entire existence be treated as a malignant fiction that never occurred. Stonemasons were dispatched across the empire with hammers and chisels to physically strike her name from every public monument and temple frieze. The rhythmic clinking of the tools served as a funeral march for her legacy, turning grand inscriptions into jagged, hollow scars in the marble. This was a war against memory itself, a systematic attempt to ensure that future generations would never know the face or the deeds of the one who defied Rome. By removing her name, they sought to remove her soul from the collective consciousness of the world, leaving only a blank space where a ruler once stood. This process extended far beyond the public squares, infiltrating the private lives and ancestral records of the people who had once sworn her their absolute and undying loyalty. All portraits and statues of the fallen queen were ordered to be smashed into unrecognizable shards or reworked into the likeness of a more virtuous and subservient Roman woman. In many cases, her image was replaced by the face of the very empress who had orchestrated her downfall. a cruel irony that forced her likeness to serve her enemy. Coins bearing her profile were recalled from circulation and melted down, their metal repurposed to pay the soldiers who had burned her cities to the ground. Even the mention of her name in polite conversation became a dangerous act of sedition that could result in a sentence of exile or a sudden death. The state demanded that the vacuum left by her absence be filled with a suffocating mandatory silence that felt heavier than the stones of the Forum. The Roman legal system took this erasure a step further by forbidding her children and kin from ever displaying her image or celebrating her life during their own funeral rites. This ensured that the lineage she fought to protect would become the very instruments of her historical oblivion, forced to pretend their own mother was a ghost. Ancestral masks, which were the pride of any noble family, were confiscated and destroyed to prevent her spirit from being honored in the privacy of the home. This was a spiritual execution intended to trap the queen in a state of eternal wandering, denied the peace that comes from being remembered by one's descendants. Without a name to be whispered in prayer or a face to be carved in stone, she was effectively exiled from both the world of the living and the realm of the gods. Rome believed that by controlling the past, they could dictate the future, ensuring that no other woman would find inspiration in her vanished rebellion. Even the official scrolls of the Roman historians were subjected to this revisionist purge, with her victories minimized and her character assassinated with the stroke of a government pen. If she was mentioned at all, she was described as a nameless Oriental plague, or a monstrous female, stripped of her individual agency and reduced to a cautionary archetype. Her strategies were credited to her male advisors, and her courage was dismissed as the reckless hysteria of a woman who had forgotten her proper place in the world. This textual genocide ensured that for centuries the only surviving accounts of these queens were written by the very men who had benefited most from their total destruction. The truth was buried beneath layers of state-sponsored fiction, designed to make the Roman Empire appear as an inevitable and divinely ordained force of nature. It was a cold, intellectual violence that aimed to kill the queen a second time, ensuring her voice would never echo through the halls of history. Yet, despite this totalizing effort to silence the past, the damnatio memoriae often failed, because the act of erasure left behind its own haunting and unmistakable physical evidence. The jagged gouges in the stone and the headless statues became silent monuments to the very women Rome tried so desperately to make the world forget. Modern archaeologists look at these empty spaces and see the ghost of a queen whose story was too dangerous to be allowed to survive in the light. Each missing line of text is a scream of defiance that the Roman chisel could never truly stifle, a testament to a power that the Senate feared even after death. The names they tried to bury have been exhaled by the earth, proving that while an empire can destroy the body, it cannot truly kill a legend that is written in the blood of the people. In the end, the silence of Rome has become a megaphone for the fallen queens, making their absence the most enduring part of their dark and immortal legacy.